So what I'd like to do this morning, I kind of broke down our sermon outline into kind of three categories in my mind. And the first category is to stop and deal with the problem that Paul has with the church's knowledge. Then we're going to identify a principle that Paul is bringing out of this. And then hopefully, by the time we're done today, begin to outline a bit of a process for us as we seek to apply this to our lives. So let's start with the problem. And the problem has to do with this knowledge, but the problem isn't that their knowledge is wrong. Right? So what Paul is not doing is saying, hey, all of us possess this knowledge, but you're incorrect in what you have come to know. He affirms it and says, okay, we've got this knowledge, and our knowledge says that idols aren't real. And our knowledge says that there's no other God but the one true God. All of that's true. The knowledge is true. So what's the problem? If knowledge and the correctness of their knowledge isn't the issue, the problem that Paul brings to bear on it is that at times, right knowledge, knowing the right thing, can lead to the wrong application. And that's what was happening for the Corinthians. So you've got the knowledge part right, but you've taken that to the wrong place and you're applying it wrongly. And the reason for that, there's two reasons in this text. So right knowledge can lead to wrong application when, number one, it's incomplete. All right, so Paul says, listen, you've got this knowledge, but it's not the full picture. Right? We know that idols aren't real. We know, verse 6 down in here, we know that there's only one true God. All of that's fine. All of that's great, but you're not looking at the full picture. So you'll notice back up in verse 2, he says that if anyone imagines that he knows something, he does not yet know as he ought to know. And so right out of the gate, Paul's saying, okay, you guys have written to me, and you've said, hey, we have this knowledge. And Paul's like, that's fine, but you're looking at only part of the picture. If you will, it would be like if we all had telescopes with us right now, or we all had binoculars, and we were to say, hey, we want to stop and sit in this room. We're going to only look through these binoculars. You're going to see real things, right? You're going to look around the room and you're going to see me probably way more large and close up than you would ever like to see me. But you're going to see Jeremy, and you're going to see that Jeremy's wearing a blue shirt, he's got hair, he's got a beard. You're going to see real, true things. But when you're only looking through the binoculars, you're not going to see everything else that's going on. You're getting a zoomed-in view of the issue. And Paul's saying that's what's going on when we're dealing with food offered to idols. So to give us a little bit of a game, I've found some pictures for us. And the first picture that we're going to put on the screen, it's a little bit hard to see, maybe because of the projector and the light, but here's the issue that we're dealing with. And your job is going to be to identify what this is a picture of. And some of you may be able to do that. But you're looking at it right now, I see some really puzzled faces. And I don't want to know what all maybe you're thinking this is, but you're looking at it and you're assessing that there's some things that we know about this picture. We can see that this picture has some sort of an object that is brown. And this object has rough surfaces. It seems like there's some depth to it, right? It seems like there's things farther back behind it. We can tell that there's light involved in this picture, and maybe two different kinds of light. We have a bluer light down on the bottom and maybe a whiter light up top, or that yellower light. And so we're looking at this, and you're trying to examine it, and you're taking in real, true facts. Things that you can observe, and you're saying, I know those things to be true about this picture. And so you're probably thinking, okay, well, maybe this is a picture of some sort of a rock formation. You're looking at it, and maybe some of you are like, that wasn't even on my radar, and that's fine. But maybe this is a rock, and this is a big rock, and we see some sun shining on it, and it's rough, and I could see how there's a bit of an overhang, and that could be. Some of you are like, maybe this is a piece of dirt. Maybe, I don't know. What you're going through your head. And if you're thinking any of those things, I'm just going to tell you right now, you're wrong. Okay, it's none of that. This picture is actually a picture of something quite wonderful, something that may make you just a little bit hungry today. It's a picture of a cupcake. Okay? But it was very hard to identify the cupcake when you're zoomed in on only part of it. You only saw part of the picture. And for some of you, maybe you guessed that it was a picture or a cupcake. But I'm going to assume that probably most of you didn't even think it was a cupcake. Like that wasn't on your radar. You weren't even thinking about it because you didn't have the whole thing. And there is a danger that can come in that you had right information. You could make accurate observations, but you were only dealing with a partial picture. And Paul is saying that when it comes to the issue that the Corinthians have brought before him of food offered to idols, they were only looking at the partial picture. And they made right and accurate assessments. They could see clearly. They're saying, yes, idols are nothing. Yes, there's only one true God. But Paul is going to, over the course of his answer to this, help them see that you're dealing with that first picture. You're only looking at a little bit of it, which can lead us to a wrong application of right knowledge. Right? When Paul's answer to the Corinthians, just to let you in on where we are headed here, is not summed up in chapter 8. Chapter 8 of 1 Corinthians is the beginning of Paul's answer to their question about food offered to idols. He's going to spend chapter 8, chapter 9, and all of chapter 10, and the first little verse of chapter 11 to answer their question about food offered to idols. But at the outset of it, he says, listen, if anyone imagines he knows something he doesn't yet know as he ought to know. Right now, this knowledge you have is a partial picture. There's more that meets the eye, and it's leading you maybe to a wrong application. Number two, right knowledge can have a wrong application when it's inconsiderate. So it can lead you to the wrong place when it's incomplete, and it can lead you to the wrong place when it's inconsiderate. Paul says that, listen, it is not enough to be correct if our correctness leads us to cause harm to other people. It says your correctness is of no value. Your knowledge has not helped you at all if living based on your knowledge has caused you to bring harm to a brother or sister in Christ. It's just not worth it at that point. You have brought about no good through this. This is where down in verse 9, we're just snapshotting a couple things real quick. He says, take care that this right of yours doesn't somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. That if we were to assume that the tidbits of knowledge that they had, that idols aren't real, that there's only one true God, if we were to assume that that is all the requisite information that they needed to assess the situation, technically, they would have the right to eat. But Paul's saying it may not be right to do so. Just because your knowledge says it's okay does not mean that you have the license to go and do this. And what he kind of begins to challenge is what lies at the heart of many people when we struggle with these things and try to navigate this, where we say, in some ways, the question that echoes that of Cain back in Genesis chapter 4, am I my brother's keeper? And Paul is going to say, in essence, as a believer, as a Christian in the church, yes, you have a responsibility to your brother. That your knowledge is not meant to be taken solely independently so that you can focus on your own freedoms and your own rights. We are to look out for one another. And if there is a struggle that a brother or sister is having when it comes to their faith and their understanding of things, we need to bring that into consideration because he says in verse 7, not all possess this knowledge. We can't assume, as we look around this room, that all of us are in the same place when it comes to our faith. Some in this place have been walking with the Lord for a better part of 50 years or more. Some are deep and veteran saints in the faith. Some of us are earlier in our walk, and we're figuring things out. We're getting our feet underneath ourselves. And we need to consider all of that so that we can act as one, that we've become one with one another. So right knowledge, this is the problem that Paul is trying to help them see. Right knowledge can have wrong application when it's incomplete or it's inconsiderate, which leads to the principle that he's identifying. And he's helping the Corinthians, he's helping us see this, and it's this principle that liberty does not always mean license when accompanied by love. Liberty does not always mean license when accompanied by love. The question that probably many of us are tugging with today is, what are we supposed to even do with all of this? That sounds great, right? We can deal with the right knowledge, the wrong application. We can deal with the license thing and recognize that just because I have the right, just because something is permissible for me, does not mean it's beneficial for me to do. Liberty does not mean license when accompanied by love. Sometimes it may be right and appropriate for us as believers, because of love for one another, to forego a liberty that we have for the sake of someone around us. As we move into chapter 9 next week, Paul's going to share a bit of an example of that from his own life. He's going to say, I'm not just saying this to put a burden on you. I'm going to show you that I'm already doing it. Right? This is something that we can live out and something that is good for us as believers. But the question still stands, what do we do with it? Do we just take these principles and we just apply them to any makeshift thing? Or how do we make sense of what Paul is bringing up? Because again, you're probably saying, I can't recall the last time that food offered to idols was a problem for me. It wasn't last week. Probably wasn't last year. Maybe if you went on a mission trip somewhere and you found yourself in a different part of the world where these temples and sacrifices were made, then maybe you're like, okay, I could see it, I experienced it there, but in my day-to-day, what good is this for me? But what we can't do is begin to dismiss what Paul is talking about. We can't dismiss 1 Corinthians 8 through 10 because we don't perceive this as an issue, because all Scripture is breathed out by God. All Scripture is profitable for reproof, correction, and training in righteousness. Why? So that the man of God may be complete and equipped for every good work. So 1 Corinthians 8 is of value to you and me today, but we have to dig in. We got to do the work to figure out, okay, what does that mean for us? So that we're not walking out of here and going to have lunch at the cafe or going back to your house or going to do whatever your day has ahead of you and saying, well, that was a pretty tough issue for those in the first century. But they got to catch up with the times. This isn't for us today. So we can look and say that the right knowledge and the wrong application stuff, that works, right? I can wrongly apply right knowledge. We can look and say, I understand that liberty isn't always a license when accompanied by love. And we could close the book and go home today. But I sat in a small group on Tuesday where we started to kick things around. And we were wrestling with these things. And we're saying, I want to know. I want to know where and how this applies to us. I want to know where I put this into practice in my life, because if this is to help me honor God, if this is to help me to serve Him and to serve my brothers and sisters well, then I want to know that. And so we begin to ask questions, and we want to play out scenarios, and we might be like, okay, maybe food offered to idols isn't it, but what about going to a casino? What about drinking alcohol? What about you fill in the blank with anything that's going on in your head right now? You're saying, what about this? And what I want to be careful of is that Paul doesn't come flat out and be like, I'm just going to draw the line for you. Because oftentimes that's what we want. We want someone to draw the line. Can we just make it abundantly clear? I don't want to have to worry about it. I don't want to be wrong. So can someone show me what's out of bounds? And I think Paul is trying to do something just a wee bit harder here. He's trying to show the Corinthians that this is a complex situation, but I want to show you how to navigate that conversation or that issue. Right? And so out of the gate, we see that Paul deals with the Corinthians with their partial picture. So Ben, you throw that first picture back up on the screen. He's like, all right, you've come to me with this. Let's deal with this. Right? There's a lot more to the picture that we need to address. We're going to address that, right? That's coming. We're going to dig into all that stuff. But for right now, Paul says, let's take the partial picture that you've brought to me and let's work off the partial picture. And as we've worked off the partial picture, one thing becomes clear, that Paul is saying, listen, the issue of food offered to idols, the problem doesn't have to do with the food. The food's not the issue here. Something else is the issue, right? We see that down in verse 8, right? It's like food won't commend us to God. We're no worse off if we do not eat, no better off if we do. Food's not the problem. But there is a problem. So the problem is we need to dig in and figure this thing out. And what's going on here is that the good thing, food, has become associated with a bad thing or an evil thing, which is idolatry. And so that becomes our kind of guiding principle. So when a good thing is associated with an evil thing, now we can start to bring some framework to our life. When that happens, there's a couple of questions we need to ask ourselves. And the first question is this: will my participation in the good thing that's associated with the bad thing, will my participation clarify or confuse my witness for Christ? Will my participation clarify or confuse my witness for Christ? See, as Christians, our lives, the whole of our lives, have become a reflection of our faith and testimony and the saving work of Christ. You can't, as a believer, say, this is the work me. This is the me that shows up Monday through Friday when I go to work, that all my coworkers see, that I kind of put on there. We can't say that here's the home me. This is what my wife or my husband and my kids, this is what my grandkids, this is who they get. And then turn around and be like, and this is my Christian me. And the one that face that I put on when I'm around other believers and I go to church. All of our life has become a testimony to the work that God has done and that God is doing. And we affirm certain things in the way that we live our life. And so in verse 6, Paul is saying, listen, for us as believers, we know that there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things, and notice this, for whom we exist. Okay, so that question, will my participation clarify or confuse my witness for Christ? Will my participating in this good thing that's become associated with an evil thing clarify that my purpose is for the glory and honor of the Father? Or is it going to confuse that? We start to navigate. Now you're starting to say, okay, it's not just about getting a fish, it's about being taught how to fish. Now I can apply that to X, Y, and Z circumstances of my life. Is that going to be confusing or clarifying? Then he goes on and says, not only that, but we have one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom are all things, and through whom we exist. So that as believers, the life that we now live, as Paul will say in Galatians, is no longer ours, but it is Christ who lives through us. So when I participate in this good thing that's now associated with an evil thing, will that clarify or confuse the fact that I now live in and through Christ? That the life I live is not my own. It's for the glory of God through the Son who has saved me from my sins, redeemed my life, made me a new creation. Will that witness be clarified or confused if I choose to participate? Now we have some things that we can begin to navigate. Now we can start to apply this to our lives. So the Corinthians, in this case, had to make a decision. If they asked themselves that question, they would have to ask, will eating food offered to idols clarify that that idols aren't real? Will it clarify that there's no God but one? Will it clarify that all things are through the Father, from the Father, and for the Father, that we exist for His glory? Will it clarify that all things come through Christ and that our life is through Christ? Or is it going to confuse those things? Because on one hand, they could ask that question and say, well, we could be making a point that idols are nothing and it's okay to eat the food offered to idols because idols are nothing. So it could confirm that. But does everybody possess the knowledge? And Paul says not everyone has that knowledge. And so what you may inadvertently communicate is something contrary to what you know and what you believe. Something that is contrary or will be perceived contrary to what is true. So that's the first question. The second question is this: will my participation then help or hinder those around me? So number one, is it going to clarify or confuse my witness for Christ? And is it going to help or hinder those who are around me? And Paul helps us understand that the decisions that we make in life are not done in isolation. A decision for Jeremy to do something is not one that only impacts Jeremy. The decisions that you make will not only impact you, they will influence and impact those who are around you. Brothers and sisters in Christ, it'll impact and influence those who are unbelievers, and they're watching your life. And Paul is trying to get us to say, listen, it's not just about drawing the line. It's about how do we bring love to bear on the decisions that we make. How do we live in community with one another? This is why he'll say we need to be careful that the exercising of your rights doesn't become a stumbling block to those who are weak. You need to be careful of that. And you need to consider that the things that you will choose to do, some of them may be of great help to those around you. They're going to set a great example to those who are watching your life. And it's going to help them see what it means to honor God, to walk faithfully with Him. There's other decisions that given them or making them may have the opposite effect. It may cause people to question. It may cause people to stumble along their way. So will your participation in the good thing that has now become associated with an evil thing help and clarify your witness, and will it help others around you? And if at any point in trying to navigate that and wrestling through it, you're like, I just am not sure. Paul's like, listen, then it's not worth it. It's not worth it. If it's going to cause a brother to stumble, I'm not going to eat meat, because eating meat is not worth it if I'm causing harm to those who are around me. What's the greater purpose? What's the greater calling in your life? So you need to examine the influence that you have on others. Who is it in your life that's watching you right now? Your kids? You got grandkids? You got people in a small group? You got peers at work? Neighbors? Who might be looking to you, knowing that you're a believer, a follower of Christ, and saying, what does being a Christian really look like? And you become the representative. And Paul's going to say, listen, on these issues where something good becomes associated with something evil, we need to slow down and ask ourselves some intentional questions. And so I thought kind of long and hard, it was like, should I give some examples of this today? Should we work through some case studies and talk about this thing or that thing? And I was wrestling through it, and I came to a place at the end where I was like, I'm going to hold on it for now. And I know that there's probably something in you that's saying, I really wish he would talk about X, Y, or Z. And I know that those questions are there, and I have those questions for myself, and I know those who were in our small group on Tuesday, I know those things got brought up. But the reason I'm going to hold on it for right now is because what Paul is trying to do is, as I said earlier, is to not just say, let's draw the line. So I don't want to come up here and be like, here's the circumstance and here's the right answer, and I'm going to draw the line in the sand and create the boundaries. Instead, what I want to try to do is what Paul is doing and saying, I want to teach you how to navigate these situations. So instead of just defining right or wrong now, we're going to get to that, right? By the end of his answer, he's going to say, here, I'm going to spell it out. Here's where we're at. But at the end of chapter 8, he's saying, I want you to learn to navigate these things with love. And so hopefully as we've worked through this, we've said, okay, there's a problem when we take knowledge and we only use incomplete knowledge. There's a problem with our knowledge if it causes us to be inconsiderate of those who are around us. Those are issues. And we need to address those issues. And we need to have the right perspective when it comes to it, so that hopefully in the Spirit of Christ, you are willing to forego a liberty that you may have as a believer for the sake of loving someone around you. And how you navigate that is you begin to ask the hard and deeper questions. What kind of impact is this going to have on my witness? Can you do it with a clear conscience? Maybe. Can other people understand just by observation? Is your participation going to bring harm? Is it going to hinder someone else in their walk with the Lord? Those are the questions. I want us to just start thinking about this issue in that lens so that as we begin to work through Paul's answer all the way through the end of chapter 10, we can keep that perspective in mind, that as he expands the picture and takes us from that first picture where we weren't really sure what it was, and he begins to pull the curtain back and show the whole thing, we have this foundation to stand on. There's something important about how we relate to one another. What does community within the church, what does Christian fellowship lead us and cause us to do for one another that we may not do if we lived our life in isolation? Because the reality that Paul is calling us to see and understand is that you cannot live out your Christian faith in isolation. It's just not happening. You may try. You may choose to try to do that, but there's no way about it because you live your life in the context of other people. So there's always others to consider. So this morning, I leave that before you, and I ask you to wrestle with these deeper things. Is your knowledge accompanied by love for those around you? Will your participation with a good thing that's become associated with an evil thing clarify or confuse your witness for Christ? Will it help or hinder those around you? And are you willing to forego a liberty that you may have for the sake of loving and ministering to those who may be around you?